A laboratory bench and a painter's easel share a border that's currently under pressure. Writing in The Atlantic earlier this month, Mark Histed looks at how a legal theory, the unitary executive, could bring the work of federal scientists under direct political control. It's a question of whether discovery survives when a single office holds the strings. Then, in a piece from Granta last week, Brodie Crellin argues for a different independence found in the God dimension of art and faith. Something interesting emerges when these are placed side by side. One piece fears the reach of the state, while the other resists the flat logic of modern life. Both suggest that certain truths only thrive when they're shielded from the center. Writing for The Atlantic earlier this month, Mark Histed examines how a specific legal doctrine, the unitary executive theory, is moving from the courtroom into the research laboratory. This shift isn't just about who signs the checks. What's worth listening for is the detail of a proposed rule that would allow political appointees to cancel scientific grants, even after they've been awarded. Notice how Histed links this to a direct challenge against the authority of Congress.
An ascendant constitutional theory is a threat to American science. The idea of a unitary executive is now being extended to America's scientific establishment with potentially devastating effects. One principle has governed science funding in the United States for decades: that scientific judgment should not be supplanted by political pressures. That is the basis upon which the country's enormous scientific achievements, progress in life-saving treatments, a university system that is the envy of the world, and a vibrant technology and biotech sector have been built. But that principle is under attack. Late last month, the Office of Management and Budget in the Donald Trump White House proposed a new regulation that would shift control over the allocation of public science funding away from scientists and toward political appointees, who will have the power not only to decide which projects receive that money, but also to, at any time, cancel grants that have already been awarded. This isn't merely an attack on science. It is part of a deeper ideological vision that many within the Trump administration have been championing for years, moving power from Congress and executive branch agencies to the president and his appointees. This vision of increased presidential power permeates Project 2025, a plan co-authored by Russell Vought, now the OMB head. And it's backed by a legal idea known as the unitary executive theory, which asserts, as Justice Antonin Scalia put it in 1988, that the president possesses all federal executive power. The unitary executive theory, in its fullest form, means that the president can review and direct all executive branch actions, and that Congress cannot restrain that power unless otherwise laid out in the Constitution. The Supreme Court has in recent years issued a series of decisions in line with the unitary executive theory, many of which are about the president's power to fire agency officials. The same theory is also behind numerous Trump administration actions taken in apparent conflict with congressional action or intent, such as the president's orders to dismantle the Department of Education and bulldoze the East Wing of the White House to build a ballroom. The administration is fighting a battle over what Congress and legislation can direct agency experts to do versus what the president has the power to control.
Now the proposed OMB rule would extend unitary executive logic to grant-making, including at America's science agencies, the foundation of its medical and industrial achievements. Elias Zerhouni, the National Institutes of Health director under President George W. Bush, earlier this year described what's at stake. When I was at NIH, it never occurred to me that I could say we're not paying for something that Congress had appropriated money for because it was not in line with my policies, he said. But if that power is given to the executive branch to use whenever it wants, then all bets are off. I have worked at NIH for more than a decade, running a neuroscience lab that investigates how the trillions of connections in brains control thought and action, work aimed at understanding conditions such as schizophrenia and autism. Before last January, scientists like me could set our own scientific goals and follow data where they led, subject to regular evaluation by a panel of external scientific leaders who would assess our progress and the value of our work. Now what I see in all of the changes reported at NIH this year, speaking for myself, not the agency, is the addition of presidential control and review steps at many levels and decision points. The proposed OMB rule, in fact, would formalize many things already happening inside NIH, such as grant cancellations, political review of grant awards, control over staff on panels that review scientific programs, even the forced alteration of words in grant proposals. An extreme assertion of executive power is bad enough when the room is a ballroom. It is far more destructive when the target is American science. Advocates for presidential control of agencies, including Chief Justice John Roberts, have argued that the president must have fine-grained control over the whole executive branch, because only the president, along with the vice president, has the accountability of being elected by the whole nation. But the science agency's great success has come while they have drawn democratic accountability from the public via Congress. The legislative process has set long-term agency priorities, and civil servants at the agencies have carried them out. The president has played a constitutional role in signing or vetoing legislation affecting the agencies, but beyond that, his power has been indirect, as an advocate who could pressure Congress, but who did not take action directly himself.
For example, in 1971, when President Richard Nixon wished to launch a war on cancer, he did not do so by directing NIH to change its priorities. Instead, he announced his plan at a State of the Union address, and then worked with Congress to enact a law, the National Cancer Act, that established a national research effort. The president did have the power to appoint the head of the National Cancer Institute, as well as the head of the NIH, but he did not exert control over the minutiae of the agency's work. Beyond their accountability to the public via the legislature, science agencies such as NIH and the National Science Foundation have also been accountable to another constituency, the scientific community. NIH and NSF rely heavily on advisory input from outside scientists. Peer review panels with rotating expert members perform review of grants. In 2023, nearly 30,000 people served as NIH peer reviewers. External scientists invest large amounts of their time in careful reviews, and those reviews heavily shape funding decisions. Advisory councils and ad hoc committees of external scientists approve new research priorities, provide a second-level review of grants, and advise the agency in setting scientific directions. Drawing on the expertise of the scientific community for funding decisions has been a key part of U.S. scientific success. Just as in economics, in which markets allow the decentralized knowledge of many individuals to be harnessed, in science, relying on peer review allows the expertise of many scientists to be brought to bear. Central planning of science via the White House and political appointees would cast aside the enormous collective expertise of the American scientific community. As the Trump administration has reorganized U.S. science, it has justified the need for change by citing long-standing critiques. For example, critics of grant peer review, even before this administration, have noted that the practice can lead scientists to be conservative and avoid pursuing high-risk blue sky work, because getting a group of reviewers to agree on the value of a risky idea is hard. But I know from my own experience writing and reviewing grants, and a team including the former NIH director Harold Varmus noted as much more than a decade ago, that the factor that cuts most acutely against big ideas is low funding rates. When 30% of grant applications were funded, there was plenty of room for peer reviewers to have differing views, and for review panels to endorse some moonshot projects alongside safe projects. Now, because the success rate has fallen, in some cases to 5%, near unanimity among reviewers is required, and only the projects that reviewers see as most certain of success will receive a green light. Shifting the science system to presidential control will do little to address this issue. What's more, big discoveries are less likely to come from projects chosen by political appointees, who are prone to picking flashy and well-marketed work instead of unusual-sounding but promising ideas that experienced scientists could identify. The OMB's proposed rule has already created outcry in the science world. Scientific societies have condemned the rule and called on their members to comment. Holden Thorpe, the editor-in-chief of Science, said in an editorial that the time to act is now. The scientific community needs to flood OMB with responses. But returning control of scientific decision-making to the scientific community will not be simple. The proposed rule is just one step in the Trump administration's efforts to put science under the president's thumb, and is aligned with the Roberts Court's vision. The unitary executive theory implies that presidential appointees must have final say over agency decisions, no matter what laws Congress passes. America is in the middle of a major shift in what the separation of powers means. A president focused on taking power for himself is backed by a Supreme Court majority that has supported that agenda.
And this means that restoring American science's vitality will need bigger thinking than just a response to this proposed rule. Scientists and allies must create a new vision for how science agencies should be run, and that vision must itself be part of a bigger rethinking of how the American government should be run. The Roberts Court is unlikely to agree with that approach, but it is worth fighting for, not just for science's sake, but for America's too.
Mark Histed leaves the listener with a picture of a firewall under siege. The worry isn't just about money. It's about the legal mechanism that would allow a political appointee to override a researcher at the NIH because their data doesn't align with a specific policy. It paints a picture of specialized knowledge being treated as a subset of executive will. Turning to Brodie Crellin's conversation with Marilynne Robinson and John Fossey, the focus shifts from the laboratory to the grand hall of the Royal Palace, but the underlying tension is the same. Where Histed identifies a threat in the unitary executive theory, Robinson and Fossey find it in a modern culture that lacks the vocabulary for the transcendental. They argue for a strenuous freedom that protects the spiritual and the artistic from being flattened by reductive politics or bad translations that turn a vindicating God into a monster. Notice how both pieces treat autonomy as a prerequisite for truth. Histed wants to keep the politician out of the lab. Robinson and Fossey want to keep the materialist out of the soul. Read together, these writers suggest that whether the subject is a biotech breakthrough or a poem by Fossey, the most vital insights happen in the spaces that a centralized authority cannot or should not reach.
This year, Marilynne Robinson delivered the Fossey Lecture, an annual speaker series established by the National Library of Norway after Jon Fossey received the Nobel Prize in 2023. Robinson's lecture, on faith and freedom of thought, sketched an American tradition of religious humanism, a deeper, purer, and more strenuous freedom than we have aspired to lately, she claimed. She spoke in the Grand Hall of the Royal Palace to an audience that included Crown Princess Mette Merritt. Fossey, who stays away from most official functions, attended the lecture, but vanished before the reception, when a choir mounted the palace staircase and sang a hymn inspired by his poem, De Store Andlitet, Boyer se Need. The day before the lecture, I met Robinson and Fossey at Café Stova, Fossey's preferred restaurant, where we spoke about God, art, and politics. Although we did not speak explicitly about their novels, Robinson and Fossey's theological positions anchor their art. The rippling, incantatory style of Fossey's septology and The Shining is the aesthetic correlative to his negative theology. His book-length sentences circle around what God is not in order to access an ineffable, invisible divine reality. The Vine trilogy, excerpted in Granta 175, Scandinavia, is cut from a different cloth. Robinson's novels are everywhere touched by her belief in the transcendental qualities of ordinary life, from Ruthie's Emersonian communion with nature in Housekeeping to the dialogues between family members across the Gilead Quartet. Both writers insist that language can make a spiritual absence as present to our senses as the objects we can see, taste, and touch. This conversation has been edited for length and clarity. Merve Emery. I received no religious education, so I was interested to learn, Marilynne, that you were teaching a class on reading the Bible. What do you want to impart to your students through your readings of the Old and New Testament? Marilynne Robinson. There are many people who feel that they did not receive any religious education, so I try to give them basic terms and concepts, simply so they can have an approach. The creation was the first category that I talked about. I use things like the passage in Proverbs that describes the spirit that is with God at creation, and the poem at the end of Job, in which God says, "Where were you?" and psalms that celebrate creation. I think that the celebratory side of the Christian tradition is very much lost. It's thought of as being punitive. The idea of understanding the amazing beauty of being is intrinsic to the literature, and part of what people have a right to. The culture has not given them the terms to express it. One of the things that is very much on my mind doing all this is that the standard translations of the Bible make God into a monster. He's jealous. He's vengeful. I bring up the fact that vengeance is a bad translation. If you look at the Vulgate, it says vindicator, to vindicate, which means not only to assign innocence, but also to assign guilt. It isn't vengeance. You see people like our horrible Secretary of War using the word vengeance and feeling that it is sanctified by a bad translation. I think a lot of what distances people from religion are the inappropriate words that have become identified with the text. Emery. Is it only a matter of bad translation that the vengeful God is the God absorbed by American culture? Robinson. There are very frightening things in the New Testament, like the apocalypse, but I think most of the grievous things that we are threatened by are things that we have created ourselves. The prohibition against killing is one that human beings violate constantly. I think that it's true in the world and it's true in the Bible that you have to make a distinction between evil in the ancient sense and human behavior. We're up to no good a great deal of the time, and to each other's enormous harm. The greatest commandment in both testaments is love the Lord. Yet out of traditionalism and sloppiness, we create an idea of God that's not very lovable, so that there's a transgression against the first commandment before anything else is launched on. I think that's a problem. I would like to be a purely objective teacher, but I think there are certain major corrections that need to be made. Emery. John, was the difference between a vengeful God and a loving God important for your religious upbringing in Norway? Jan Fosse. The Old Testament talks about this vengeful God. The New Testament talks about the love of God. The only thing said about God in the New Testament is that God is love, nothing else. In the European tradition, you have an apophatic theology, a negative theology, in which you cannot say anything about God. He's hidden behind concepts. He is outside time and space. Our human language is far too limited to say anything wise about him, anything worth saying. That is my position. I cannot say anything about God, except for that I believe in God. What I mean when I say I believe in God is that there's something in my life that is the truth. It's not an intellectual truth. It has more to do with a presence, a way of experiencing life and art, than with any idea or concept or attribute that you imagine as God. The strongest believers are the agnostics, because they don't know what God is. To me, that's a very fair and wise position. Robinson. But a great deal has been said about God. The approachability of God is related to the traditions of language that surround him. Believing in God is believing in the benevolence of God. It's believing in the goodness of creation and in certain primary things that are said, and that we accept as truth. Then there are, for example, the ideas of God as vengeful and jealous that stand in the way of this deeper perception that one might have about the nature of God. Fosse. There's a huge division, for me, between the creator and creation. You can still see God in what is created, but that isn't his essential being. This is, historically, the polemical difference between positive and negative theology. Emery. Marilyn, what do you mean by the approachability of God? Robinson. Whether you can be at peace with the intuition that you have of God. Emery. I am interested in the attempts you've made to ground humanism in religious belief. At least since the Enlightenment, the development of humanism as a philosophy or an ethical program has involved purging it of religion. What is at stake for you in restoring the intuition of God to it? Robinson. The idea of trying to create a humanism purged of religious content is a modern project. It steps out of the tradition of humankind up to that point. If you look at the Renaissance, its idea of humanism comes directly out of the religious traditions that lie behind it. I think the most important humanists are the religious humanists, people like Pico della Mirandola and Dante. We've created an artificial inevitability around the modern idea that there's something appropriate in birthing nihilism or atheism or agnosticism out of a tradition that is profoundly religious. Fosse. When we were talking about knowing something about God, the thinker who has taught me the most, the thinker who, in a way, made me an organized Catholic, was Meister Eckhart. He lived in the 13th century in Germany and in France. The way he talked about God was very provocative at the time, but it was very close to another influence in my life, Norwegian Quakerism. The Norwegian Quakers had this concept of the inner light that emanated from inside of you, which brought you closest to God. To hear his voice, you had to listen to silence. God spoke through silence. The Quakers sit in a circle, keep quiet, and try to concentrate on the inner light. If you feel that you can say something good for others, You say it. Otherwise, you keep quiet. I've been to Quaker meetings, but I don't like organizations. I'm an anarchist in that way. It's a paradox, since I'm also a Catholic. But I'm still very close to Quakerism, which perhaps is an extreme form of Protestantism. You take away everything in the Catholic tradition and in the Mass, and then Catholicism and Quakerism can meet. Where do they meet? They meet in the mystery of faith. That's at the center of Catholicism, and it's at the center of Quakerism, which places the inner light of the Catholic vision inside the human being. Emre. John, what is the history of Norwegian Quakerism? Fosse. The Quakers came to Norway from England. In my family, my grandfather belonged to a group of Quakers in the Southwest. It's always been a very small community, which was part of the problem for me. There are only something like 150 organized Quakers in this country. It's a bit too intimate. That's the great thing about the Catholic Church, which has a long, diverse tradition in Norway. The churches are full, not because of a few Norwegian converts like myself, but because of immigrants from Poland and the Philippines. They belong to a worldwide movement, with a history that they pretend goes back to St. Peter. It's a story, but it's their story. If you join a community, you believe its stories, even if they are, in a sense, myths. Emre. Marilyn, how does John's description of the inner light of Quakerism and Catholicism strike you? It reminds me of the revivalist preacher Jonathan Edwards, who has been an important figure for you. Robinson. Edwards wrote an essay called A Divine and Supernatural Light, which is an exaltation to a higher experience of light. He's talking about seeing light and understanding that it's an emanation of something more exalted, which has to be apprehended by human beings to have the meaning that it has. I come from the Congregationalist tradition, which is extremely Protestant, very near Quakerism. I also write interpretations of lectionary texts for L'Osservatore Romano, the Vatican's newspaper. I write for them what I would write for my own church, and they seem to think it's just fine. It's very gratifying to know that across a great deal of difference, there is like-mindedness about very essential things. Emre. Both of you are interested in preserving lost or unappreciated traditions, in taking a text or a thinker who has been misunderstood by secular culture, and showing us how many of our profane ideas carry a tincture of religious belief, even if we don't recognize it. Robinson. Talking about Meister Eckhart or Johannes Thaler, I think that if they were writing today, the essence of what they wrote would be the same thing. They're not trapped in their time. I don't feel a nostalgia for the past, but an apprehension that brilliant people were right about many things in the past. The relegation of them to another century ought not to interfere with the fact that it's the treasure of humanity that people have said such true things. It's not a conservative impulse of restoration. It's simply finding gold, knowing that it's gold. Fosse. Even Plato spoke of the one God. He based his philosophy on God. This was the beginning of the European philosophical tradition. Of course, it was before Christ and Christendom, but still, the feeling of the divine was something that you could get close to. It was independent of your way of believing. You could call it whatever you want, and you could believe in it this way or that way. You can follow this way of thinking all the way through European history, and all the way up to the 18th century, when you first encounter atheism and materialism and positivism and a scientific ideal which has been proven wrong by science itself. The English and the German Romantics were very much against this concept of modernity, and were closer to a kind of religious way of understanding. The same held true for modernism, which was based on Romanticism to a large degree. Emre. But you're both suspicious of religion as doctrine. In your novels and in your essays, religion is rarely propositional. It's a way of apprehending or experiencing the world. But when secular people think about religious people, they often think first and foremost about doctrine. Fosse. If you write doctrine, then you're a bad writer. If you have some talent as a writer, you don't do that. You create a universe. If you manage to write well, this universe and its sense of wholeness will say what has to be said. Each part of what you write can say this and that, but then the wholeness will speak, always, of course, in a silent way. I think that in all great art and in all great literature, you have this connection. You can see God in it. It isn't about the subject or the doctrine or the theory. It's about quality. If it has that quality, it has a transcendental force that is pointing to something. No one can tell exactly what that something is. Emre. Marilyn, do you think the same way? Is that how you write and how you read? Robinson. I think that the great question is, how deeply do you see? How fully do you encounter the fact that the person you're dealing with is the image of God? The joy of being religious is that you discipline yourself in seeing more deeply than you would otherwise see. The idea of finding the sacred, of finding it implied in the existence of anyone you encounter, is like having scales fall from your eyes. My sense of religion is all bound up with the degree to which the fineness of being an image of God is something that you understand in yourself and that you see in other people. That's humanism. Fossey. Each and every human being has something that is completely specific to them, and at the same time completely universal. That's what I would call God, or the part of God in them. If you don't see that uniqueness in another human being, you reduce the value of that human being to just a body. For me, it goes back how we are created with a soul and a body, and how no one has never managed to explain the relation between them. Emre. Marilyn, do you feel that no one has ever sufficiently explained the relationship between the body and the soul? Robinson. Absolutely not. I think of the soul as being very deeply integrated with the body. The body is a splendid, beautiful, amazing thing, but the soul is not explained. I think that it's denied as an experience because it's not explained. Positivistic sorts of people feel that if they cannot explain something, if they cannot describe it in their own terms, that means it doesn't exist. But I think that the soul is one of the most deeply felt experiences the human being ever has. Fossey. Yes, body and soul are integrated. That's almost a dogma in the Christian tradition. It's like in a work of art, what you might call content and form. They have to be integrated completely to make it a great work of art. And this integration is the spirit of a work of art. It has a purpose of its own. Emre. John, you've spoken about listening to the silence and hearing a voice. Marilyn, you've spoken about the voice of the Reverend John Ames, the narrator of Gilead, coming to you. What is the practice of listening more sensitively that religion has taught you? Robinson. It's not something I acquired, like a competence in a field. It's more a willingness. It's not a choice. It's an acceptance. I can't write fiction if I don't have a voice in my head. And I don't know where these voices come from, but I know they develop over time. At a certain point, I think I know what to say, or the voice knows what to say. You feel that something is emerging that will matter to you, and you do your best to try to be faithful to it. To think you know where it comes from is a presumption that destroys the project. Fossa. I completely agree. Even if I don't want to have a message or a doctrine, I still feel when writing that I had something crucial to say. If you are a real writer, then you don't write for money or ambition, or to be an artist or a bohemian. You write because it's a necessity that gives itself to you. It's a gift. Emre. Marilyn, in one of your most recent essays, you observe that people on the far right believe themselves to be religious. What is the difference between someone who merely believes himself to be religious and someone who truly is? Is there a particular political urgency to this distinction? The problem is to defend Christianity, to defend religion. The idea that religion has been claimed by people who cut off the aid to the hungry masses of the world and called themselves Christian. You have to defend Christianity from associations with people that will abuse it. For the sake of most people, who at this point have very little independent experience of religion, you have to tell them that the great moral energies behind the culture do not endorse cutting off food aid. They don't endorse the impoverishment of poor or irrational hostility. Christianity became connected to the political powers in the Roman Empire. That was how it became a world religion, and that connection has remained, but it goes back.
If you go back to the roots of Christianity, it isn't political in the sense of power struggle at all. Robinson. The politics unfolds as the care that we take of one another. That's what it ultimately comes down to. How much latitude we give each other. How much opportunity to flourish we give each other. That's a religious question, because we're talking about the image of God. If you see people insulted and deprived over and over again, you know that you're seeing something that is both political and religious in the most negative sense of both words. The idea that you actually can separate them is kind of amazing to me. We're told very explicitly in the Bible about lending and giving and feeding. Politics is the method through which these things are done or not done. Fossey. But if literature becomes political, if it has a doctrine, then it becomes bad literature, like in social realism that was very popular in Norway in the 1970s. If you try to adapt literature to a political intention, then it ends up as bad writing. Literature has to be there for its own sake, but by being there for its own sake, it also has ethical and political stakes. Robinson. Well, I don't write the political in my fiction. It's not political, but I write political things so that that burden doesn't fall on my fiction. Fossey. But all art is political. If it's good art, it's political because of its aesthetic quality. This also gives it an ethical quality, which has political implications. I think that some good writers have been very bad from a political point of view, but still the writing isn't. Knut Hamsun was a Nazi, no doubt, but he was an extremely good writer. You have to separate a great writer from his political thinking. Emery. Hamsun is the great Norwegian example. Marilyn, who would you say is the classic American example of a great writer with terrible politics? Pound? Robinson. The writer who excites my students and is a very destructive influence is Nietzsche. He is not a local boy, but nevertheless he speaks to the sophomore heart. Emery. Where do you see the destructiveness? Robinson. Nietzsche encourages a kind of elitism that young people, especially people from some degree of privilege, are happy to adopt. They're happy to think that they're excused from morality that would teach them any kind of humility. Frankly, young people are vulnerable to that. I don't see good writers who write in his tradition.
Fossey. But I think that lies in the tradition of translating the German word Übermensch into English as Superman. The Nietzsche they are thinking about isn't the real Nietzsche. There's a problem with the translation. Robinson. Well, I've read enough just to keep up with my students. Nietzsche was a sick man. Emre. Does the future of literature and religion feel like one of plenitude for each of you? Robinson. I think that religion is beautiful, and that it comes very naturally to human beings. You look at the world, and everyone's being religious in his or her own way. My church is next to a university. There are always clusters of churches around universities, and the students are attending church. The Methodist Church is the church of the Iowa Writers' Workshop, and I'm not a Methodist, and so I have to deal with that. But in any case, it is a fantastically vast vocabulary of experience. The accumulation of it over time is a richness added to richness added to richness. It's something that human beings have made for themselves, in the sense that it's a spontaneous product of human nature. I think that the absence of it is an artificial deprivation. But it will pass. Fossey. I think you cannot possibly explain life in a scientific or positivistic or materialistic way. There's a space for art and for literature. It's the space for religion. I cannot understand people who accept the quality of literature, but don't accept that this might have something to do also with the religious dimension of life. I was once invited to the Vatican to meet the Pope. Even if the artists don't need the church needs the artists. And that has to do with the transcendental dimension of all good writing. But when I was young, I hated the Norwegian Lutheran Church. I left it at 16. As a child, I had no belief. I thought it was pure stupidity. For a long time, in Europe, in Norway, it was impossible to be a writer and a believer at the same time. For my generation, it was a kind of rebellion. But things changed with postmodernism and the theological turn in French phenomenology, in books like Jean-Luc Marien's God Without Being. I don't think we will go back to atheism or positivism. It isn't possible anymore. Emre. Marilyn, did you ever have a youthful lapse of faith? The only moment I had of that kind was when I was still in high school, and my brother was at college. Whenever he came home, he brought all his books. And I was there reading all the books that he brought home from college, and I read myself into atheism. It was as if a ceiling came down on my head and walls came in. The reduction in scale of my imagination, of my existence, was so radical. I would have run screaming from this little room if it had been an actual little room. It was a very vivid experience for me, the feeling of loss and depletion. I'm not talking about whether I felt the absence of some sort of protection or assurance or anything. It was the closing down of the implications of experience. I just couldn't stand it. Emre, how did you reverse out of the atheism that you had read yourself into? Robinson, my religion when I was young was basically a matter of thinking I was very much contained in my own experience. My family was not particularly religious at all. It was like something that occurred to me, that was real to me out of my own experience, which meant that when I realized how antagonistic this worldview seemed to me, I could put it aside. I could find my way back to my habitual way of thinking and perceiving. Fossa, for me, it was the other way around. I felt that the church, its doctrine, it was reducing life too much and throwing away what gave life value for me. Emre, when did you come back? It was my own writing. I didn't know where it came from. That opened up another dimension. And after being in that dimension, I needed to call it God. Or at least God had something to do with that dimension. And then I needed company from other strange people. I've always been a kind of religious writer, but it's only around 15 years ago that I became a member of a church. I don't have the belief of a child. I have the belief of an elderly man, or a middle-aged one. Marilynne Robinson is the author of Housekeeping, Gilead, Home, Lila, and Jack, and most recently, Reading Genesis. Her essay, The Wasteland, published in Granta 15, The Fall of Saigon, is free to read online. Jan Fossa is the author of Septology, The Shining, and the forthcoming Vime, an extract from which appeared in Granta 175, Scandinavia. Image copyright Wolfgang Hasselmann.
What lingers is the image of a lab bench or a painter's easel being pulled toward a single, heavy center of power. Whether it's a legal theory aiming for control over federal grants, or a culture that demands every spiritual impulse serve a political end, the result is a thinning out of what's true. These perspectives suggest that some corners of life must remain beyond the reach of a central office to stay honest. If every discovery and every prayer must first pass a loyalty test, who is the truth really for?